Okay, time to begin.
Okay, so let me just quickly introduce our next presenter, Mr. Shane Donald. And as you can see, the title is showing up here on the screen. So a very exciting and a wonderful topic on atheists, agnostics, and true believers. What instructors in a university extensive reading program believe about extensive reading. So this wonderful topic, Shane, it's yours. Please take off.
Okay, Mahinda, thank you. So first of all, I should apologize for the length of the title, but I hope it clearly expresses what I'll be talking about today, which I think is an under-investigated area of extensive reading research. Generally, we focus on, as researchers of ER, basically students and what they gain from the process and vocabulary acquisition, syntactical knowledge, and so on. But we don't really focus much on teachers. And I think that's probably a mistake because generally teachers' practice is informed by beliefs and experiences. And what teachers believe about extensive reading, I think, is transferred and transmitted to students through their teaching practice. So I teach at a private university in Taiwan, Fengjia University, and we have an extensive reading program in our freshman English year. And that means roughly about 4,000 of our students are doing extensive reading. Though by some markers in the literature, maybe we aren't doing extensive reading. Students are required to read 100,000 words per semester. And that's part of the data that I have to show today. Whereas in some other researchers like Nagasaki in Japan, who did a 4-year program, his students read 3 million words in 4 years. But for our purposes today, I would call what we do extensive reading. So moving on, before we begin, just a few questions to think about. So generally, what I'm presenting here is informed by the ideas as follows. What do teachers believe about extensive reading? Followed by, what do teachers believe about extensive reading as a pedagogical strategy? So as John McAllister's research has shown, actually teachers largely, even when implementing extensive reading, are not familiar with the approach. It may be an institutional requirement and they're told, implement extensive reading. So they have to become familiar with the approach and then think about how does it integrate with their pedagogy? And then what factors prevent teachers from utilizing extensive reading within their teaching practice? So in the data I'll present today, you'll see actually that some teachers are relatively clueless about extensive reading, even when they're required to implement it as part of their teaching practice. Other teachers are informed by their experiences as readers or teachers or students who learned English as a foreign language. And generally, this research is basically inspired by Dan Bamford's principles of extensive reading. You can probably remember what they are. I don't have time to go over them now. But basically, the 10 principles, you could describe them as falling under 3 areas, which is basically student behavior, student determination, and then teacher behavior. But it's almost like, steps 9 and 10, the teacher will serve as a model of the reader is tacked on at the end. But what does that actually mean? And how do teachers actually do that? So just to summarize, as the audience probably know, extensive reading is informed by these principles. Students select what they want to read. The purposes of reading are usually based on pleasure, reading for fun, gaining information, or reading for comprehension or understanding. The concept of I-1 from Nation, reading materials should be well within the linguistic competence of students. They should be reading at a vocabulary level below their current apprehension. And the key thing I'm talking about today, teachers orient students to the goals of the program and also serve as a model of a reader. Now, I won't say that this final point here is problematic, but it's definitely not easy. So as you'll see in the data I'll show today, that even when you have a common extensive reading program, as we do at Fengjia University, with several teachers having to implement extensive reading. How teachers do that is really influenced and informed by a range of beliefs and experiences, and sometimes lack of knowledge. So moving on, what I'm really looking at today is teacher cognition. And the main proponent of teacher cognition is Simon Borg, but in his research, he mostly has focused on teacher beliefs about grammar. And what he's really looked at is, do teachers enact their beliefs about grammar in their classroom practice? But with regard to extensive reading, this is possibly problematic because you don't teach extensive reading. As an instructor, you're a guide to students. You are someone who's meant to inspire them to read, but you can't teach them to read. If reading's for pleasure, for example, what role does assessment play in that? Should teachers be emphasizing particular areas of language acquisition? So what teachers do is affected by what they think. And generally, a lot of research, not just in reading, shows this, that actually teachers do what they believe. And then through their classroom instruction, they pass on these beliefs to their students. So I would argue actually the most important variable in extensive reading at the beginning is the teacher, because the students are going to perform and enact extensive reading based on the information they get from their teacher, what enthusiasm he or she shows for extensive reading, and the beliefs that teachers demonstrate or enact. So what we're going to look at in a moment is the idea of teacher beliefs and then practical knowledge. Are they in sync or not? So what are beliefs? Well, they're mental constructs of teaching and learning. And they're a form of declarative knowledge, not procedural knowledge. It's the idea that something is the case because it is the case. So if you read a lot of literature about extensive reading, generally, of course, the literature refers to the benefits. So Yamashita, for example, talks about students will benefit in vocabulary acquisition, syntactical knowledge, cultural knowledge, become more fluent in reading, and possibly develop the identity of being a reader. But again, is that really the case? So some examples include ideas teachers have about learners, what good teaching looks like, how lesson plans and activities should proceed. And generally, beliefs are informed by experience. But there's another factor in play, which is teacher knowledge. So what teachers know, not what they believe, but what they know, is generally derived from practice. So we have procedural knowledge, which is awareness of how to do something. So basically, teachers develop the idea of how to teach based on experience, and also how effective their activities, their pedagogy will be with groups of learners. But it's a tricky thing, because it's sometimes the case you can't explain how your procedural knowledge works. It's implicit. So it's like driving a car. You can't explain how you do it, perhaps, but you know how to do it. So teachers make sense of and deal with classroom events, classroom management, management of tasks. They develop pedagogical knowledge based on experience, but in the background, humming away, are their beliefs. So what I did was I had a focus group with some of my colleagues, and we have 4 levels in our program, level 1 being the lowest, level 4 being the highest. And we had 1 teacher from level 2, 4 from level 3, and 1 from level 4. I don't count myself because I was the coordinator, the moderator of the focus group, but I'm in one of those levels. All of the instructors were Taiwanese, apart from M, who's from the United Kingdom. So after I had the focus group, I had recorded that, I transcribed the interaction verbatim, and then coded for themes using in vivo software. And this is what I found. So the focus group began with, what do teachers believe about extensive reading? So you'll see some lengthy data extracts coming up. You can scan through them. I'll just highlight the key points. So my first question was, what do people in the focus group, what did they know about extensive reading? For Jay, it was reading outside the class. So no notion of reading for pleasure. For Y, students can select what they wish to read. For M, it should be easy, relatively easy, and students don't need a dictionary to process the text. So reading at a natural pace. So you can see initially, these are the beliefs that teachers had. But R was slightly different. So his idea was, it doesn't have to be outside of class, but it's unsupervised. And students read at their own pace, and they develop in vocabulary. That was what he thought extensive reading was. So being exposed to text, repeating, recycling vocabulary and grammar, exercising the brain. But you can see here, he says, I came to this focus group because I don't really have a firm grasp of ER. And he goes on to say, I need to get a better idea. How can you measure? So he's coming at it from a pedagogical point of view. What are you measuring and how? How do you allow for assessment, probably? How do you quantify or have numbers on things? And then he says, from what I understand, you're not really supposed to test them. So you can see he has some initial beliefs about the extensive reading process, informed probably by what he's read. But he already has questions, and he seems quite conflicted. So we'd probably call him, at this stage, maybe agnostic about the approach. He wants to believe, but he's not sure. So I then moved on and asked teachers what they believed about ER as a pedagogical strategy. And M decided to focus on the difficulty. So students are required, he pointed out, to be self-motivated. They self-select reading material. They're generally reading outside of class. You're giving students a lot of autonomy. What is the upshot of this? And again, there are problems to do with level. Are they reading at the right pace? But essentially, it's informed by learners being self-motivated and buying into the idea of the benefits of extensive reading. And he says, that's a key difficulty. How do you take the thing and how do you evaluate what you're doing? So we can see an emergent concern already for teachers. They need to evaluate learner progress. How do you do that? So moving on, I asked, what prevented teachers from using ER as part of their teaching practice? Now, once again, in the context I'm describing here, it's required. And as you'll see in later data, the assessment measurement was from mReader, which I imagine many of you have heard of. So students would take quizzes online, basically 70% comprehension, passing the quiz, getting 70% right. You've got the word count for that book. Now, Y points out it's hard to implement for practical reasons. So we have 2 credits, that's 2 hours of classroom instruction. There's a lot going on. Once again, there's assessment coming out. So we can do a short quiz or something, but is it enough? Can you actually assess what your students have gained from reading that text? So I'd argue there's a deeper concern here. What learning is occurring through extensive reading? So for Y, she appears to be questioning the approach that assessment is relatively superficial. So can you actually prove students are gaining in vocabulary? Are they gaining cultural knowledge? It's very hard to say. Now, R, again, you can see he wants to believe, but he says, I don't know how to teach it. Now, again, if you look at the central tenets of extensive reading, as a teacher, you're almost the guide on the side. You introduce the concept, you might introduce some reading material, and then you let students self-select based on vocabulary comprehension, probably, and let them have at it. So for R, I don't know how to teach it. I don't know how to assess it. I don't know how to do anything with it. I mean, I guess I can say, all right, guys, I want you to read a book a week, but I would feel naked. So you can see R feels exposed here. So this seems to go against what he knows about teaching. Possibly that this doesn't feel like teaching. that you're actually asking your students to be autonomous learners, to go out and read at their own pace, learn and develop at their own pace, which for him at least is highly threatening, it would appear. Especially what jumps out for me is I don't know how to do anything with it. So moving on, this part is quite long now. Ari is not R, this is a different person. And she goes on to say her reasons are similar to others for practical reasons. The curriculum already has a great deal to do. But her suggestion is we should probably have a more focused course. So, for example, Day and Bamford argue that you can integrate extensive reading easily into any language course. But Ari's argument is actually have an elective class devoted to extensive reading. So again, R and Y are asking, like an elective, like an elective. So Ari, she's pondering and she says, actually, I would prefer that we're not just checking comprehension, but we can actually discuss something deeper because these are college students. They're university students, and we should probably talk about themes in the reading, the meaning of the story, probably taking more ideas from literature. We'll see on the next slide why she believes so. But basically have something that isn't just a comprehension course. But again, I would point out in this program that we're part of at Fongjia University, it's a part of the course, but it's not the whole course. There are other things to do. So I selected a different participant and I asked, do you have a reason for not implementing extensive reading? And she said, I did it before and I wanted them to enjoy reading and then assessing what's that. So enjoy the idea of reading something and get into reading. So you can also argue that Jay is very idealistic about the extensive reading approach. But what she found was students didn't care. They just treated it as an assignment and they focused on not consistent, steady reading. They did it mostly at the end of the semester, which was demotivating for her as an instructor. So she goes on to say, it becomes really painful for them and painful for me. I tried a lot of different things to encourage them, and I introduced readers I thought they'd be interested in, but they're just not interested in them. Jay chimes in, she says, yeah, because they hate reading. So she saw no buy-in from the students and it upset her and made her feel frustrated. So for this teacher, at least, you could almost argue now that she's atheistic in her view of extensive reading. So her belief was that you could actually get students to enjoy reading, that you didn't need to emphasize the aspect of assessment or language acquisition, that students could maybe develop the identity of being a reader. So just to recap, for Jay, who you've just seen, probably atheistic. Previously for R, probably someone who wants to believe, possibly agnostic, because he's probably saying he doesn't have the pedagogical tools to integrate extensive reading into his classroom practice. For Y, probably also agnostic perhaps. The practical concern, is there enough time to do this? So M chimes in again. So he must say, I tried a lot of times, but my experience is very similar to Jay. There's this is a kind of terrible expression, overwhelming apathy that comes from students. And he also goes on to say, again, he's from the United Kingdom. There's this real struggle culturally to think of something which is easy as being educational. So his argument is, possibly as someone who's not Taiwanese, that students don't view extensive reading as learning because it's meant to be easy. You're reading for pleasure, you choose what you want to read based on interest, and ideally it should be below your current comprehension level. And he believes that students don't feel that that's really learning. So one final aspect that informs teacher beliefs about extensive reading is their experience as a learner. So Ree goes on to talk about being a student in a literature class, not that positive, because teachers didn't explain cultural meanings and they just gave questions and expected us to understand everything. So if you look at an assessment platform like mReader, the questions are more to check for comprehension. They're not actually looking at deeper understanding, for example, cultural meanings. So for Ree, she says, it was torture for me taking literature class. So how to guide your students to read something is very, very important. So for her, it affects whether she's interested in teaching reading or not. So her argument is make it a separate class. Have a class devoted to extensive reading that learners have chosen to take, not that they're required or forced to take. So what emerged here was her previous experience had quite a strong bearing on how she approached extensive reading. And she felt frustrated because she couldn't go deeper into stories with her learners. So basically, what can be done in this case? So if you're working in a university like I am and you have an extensive reading program, actually how you introduce extensive reading to teachers has a great deal to do with how they will introduce it to learners. So I would argue you need orientation workshops for teachers who are novices with extensive reading on how to implement extensive reading. So looking a little bit at extant research, also the tenets that inform the approach, and basically experience sharing of how teachers have implemented ER in their classrooms. Possibly give teachers more autonomy in course design, especially regarding assessment. Now, would this lead to increased teacher and learner motivation? I honestly don't know. But you could see in the short data that I've shown that teachers were highly focused on how do I assess extensive reading. And a platform like mReader is wonderful for teachers because you don't have to read book reports, you don't have to design quizzes, they're already there. But some teachers were feeling something's lacking. They would actually like to assess the cultural knowledge that their students have gained, for example. Is it possible to offer extensive reading as a course rather than a supplement or a component to one? I'd love to hear people's experience if they do actually offer dedicated extensive reading classes. I think also it's highly important to listen to colleagues' concerns about curriculum development and design, through experience sharing. So people are more likely to feel invested if they have skin in the game. If they help design the curriculum, then they're more likely to implement it and care about how it's going to go. Ultimately, I'd say it maybe has something to do with what type of colleague you are. So, if you want to share the benefits of extensive reading with colleagues, if you already have a program and they're new to the program, then, it's a good idea to go over, say hello, and ask if they have any questions about what extensive reading is. Because it is actually surprising to me sometimes if you mention extensive reading to people, they really don't know what it is. No, they're much more familiar with intensive reading because that's what they do in the classroom. Also, I'd suggest you could do extensive reading in the classroom, even for just 10 minutes. Because, exposure to text, at least in the classroom, you can see, hopefully, fingers crossed, that your students are reading. So there's a diagram I've seen. I think if students read for 5 minutes a day, they see 188,000 English words in an academic year. If they read for 10 minutes a day, I think they see 800,000 words. 20 minutes a day, they see 1.8 million words. Now, that's a lot of recycled vocabulary. Some people would point out, well, where's the development? Are they making vocabulary gains? Well, yes, if they're doing enough reading, but in-class reading is probably one way to go about doing that. So if any of you are researchers of your own context or doing action research, actually looking at teacher beliefs in relation to extensive reading is a highly under-researched area. Because I think we tend to focus on looking at our students, vocabulary gains, learner motivation, grammar, syntactical knowledge. But this is an area that really, I think, deserves a lot more exploration. So I think I'm almost at the end of my allotted time here.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Shane. Don't worry about the time. Okay, yeah, we're just over 20 minutes, but yeah, I think we're
Sorry about that.
but we're very happy that we could get, you know, as much as we can from what seemed to